How Egyptian is Coptic? This might seem like a stupid question, and many of my followers will probably agree with me and say, well, Coptic is Egyptian. But I've seen posts and comments on social media where people overemphasize a distinction between Egyptian written in hieroglyphs and Coptic. This is often done by people who adhere to certain ideologies and say that ancient Egyptian is closer to another language, let's say Wolof, than to Coptic. But I've also seen Egyptians write things like, the ancient Egyptians actually spoke Masri and Coptic is actually Greek. So today I'd like to give you a glimpse at how Coptic relates to hieroglyphic Egyptian. And at the end of this video I'll show you that you can just take Coptic texts and write them in hieroglyphs and it's still the same language. First, let me give you a quick overview over the chronology of the Egyptian language. The first written accounts of Egyptian hieroglyphs from the early dynastic period are labeled as Archaic Egyptian. This writing system became more refined during the Old Kingdom, which is called Old Egyptian. At the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, writing became more standardized and reformed, which we call Middle Egyptian. From the latter half of the New Kingdom, there is a new form of written Egyptian that we call Late Egyptian. Late Egyptian was used for private and administrative documents, whereas Middle Egyptian remained the standard for official inscriptions and religious texts. During the Late period, Demotic gradually replaces Late Egyptian. And during the Roman period, Coptic gradually takes the place of both Demotic and Middle Egyptian, thus becoming the only written style of Egyptian. All of these are chronological stages of the same language. So Middle Egyptian is a little different from Old Egyptian, and Late Egyptian is a little different from Middle Egyptian, and Demotic is a little different from Late Egyptian, etc. But in Coptic you still find words and morphemes and syntactic structures that are already attested in Old Egyptian, 3000 years prior. So similar to my last video on the Egyptian dialect of Arabic, I'd like to make a systematic comparison between Coptic and earlier stages of Egyptian. One thing you might want to look at for such a comparison is basic lexicon. Check out my previous videos on basic Egyptian vocabulary. There is part 1, part 2, and part 3. All three videos have the words spelled in hieroglyphs but also compared to their Coptic form. But in this video, like in the last one, I'd like to look at some very basic elements of any language. And the first one is numerals. These are the numbers from 1 to 10 in Middle Egyptian, and you can see we find most of them spelled out, which is why we can easily transliterate them. And today I'll compare everything to the Akhmimic dialect of Coptic because it's phonologically very conservative. Coptic alone basically gives us a good idea on how to vocalize the Middle Egyptian numerals. But lucky us, there was also a tablet found in Amarna that had the numbers from 1 to 10 written in Akkadian cuneiform. Only 1 and 2 aren't legible because the tablet is damaged. Still, if we transliterate those cuneiform signs, we can get a good idea at how Egyptian numbers were pronounced during the time of the New Kingdom. In this video, again, I'll use the International Phonetic Alphabet to make the comparisons easier. So, how did Egyptians count from 1 to 10 during the New Kingdom? W, Senau, Chamte, Fetau, Dio, Isau, Safre, Chemane, Pesite, Mute. And in Coptic, a millennium later, We, Sno, Chamt, Ftau, Diu, Sau, Sachef, Chmun, Psit, Met. And I think the diachronic changes in phonology are pretty minimal considering the long time that has passed. Now compare this to any language you want. Wolof, Albanian, Arabic, Tamil, you won't find anything that is similar. Let's look at another very basic element of languages, personal pronouns. In this case, the so-called independent pronouns in Egyptian. And again, I can put Akhmimic Coptic next to them, and even without the help of the International Phonetic Alphabet, you can see that it's basically the same. Still, let's look at the IPA, and the Middle Egyptian forms are already vocalized. So these pronouns mean I, you masculine, you feminine, he, she, we, you plural, they. In Middle Egyptian, this sounded something like enak, entak, entach, entaf, entas, enan, entatchen, entasen. And in Coptic, anak, entak, ento, entaf, entas, anan, entotne, entau. There are a few subtle differences though, like the word for you feminine, entach versus ento, doesn't quite look the same. And also the word for they, entasen versus entau, looks a little off. But all of these differences are the result of gradual diachronic language change. Like the word in touch, you feminine looked like this originally. But even in Middle Egyptian we also see it written like this, in tat. The merger of ch and t is a general phonological rule in Egyptian. And then in late Egyptian we see it written as nta without the second t, and it had the woman determinative added, so at least in writing it can be distinguished. And that's why it's sometimes very informative to also look at late Egyptian and Demotic. And this is basically already the same form that we have in Coptic, nta, at least in the Achmimic dialect. We also have nta in the Fayumic dialect. The other pronoun that behaved a little odd was this one, ntasen, they. In late Egyptian we also see it written like this, ntau. This is no random sound change and seems to be influenced by the plural ending of nouns, and it's basically already identical to the Coptic form ntau. Another set of pronouns that I find interesting in Egyptian is the suffix pronouns. If I take for example the word for name and I want to say my name, your name, his name, etc., I'm adding suffix pronouns. These are, by the way, very similar to the suffix pronouns in Semitic languages, in Amazigh languages, and in Chadic languages, which shows that Egyptian is an Afro-Asiatic language. If we compare this to Coptic, it looks a little different. And whereas in Middle Egyptian you'd hear something like Rine, Rinek, Rinech, Rinef, Rines, Rinen, Rineten, Rinesen, the Coptic form would be more like Baren, Begren, Beren, Befren, Besren, Benren, Betenren, Buren. But again, there's a gradual development that explains the Coptic forms. So let's look at the Middle Egyptian word for name, Rin. It can mean name, a name, or the name. And then adding the suffix if, you get Rinef, which is his name. One of the innovations of late Egyptian is definite articles. There's b for the masculine, d for the feminine, and n for the plural. And it's still the same in Coptic. So in late Egyptian, Rin means name, but how do you say the name? You say Perin. And when you want to say his name, you don't put the f suffix at the end of the noun, but at the end of the article, which gives you Pefrin. And that's the same in Coptic, Pefren. That gives us another paradigm of saying my name, your name, his name, etc. that became more dominant throughout late Egyptian and Demotic. So in that time period, it was probably something like Perin, Pekrin, Perin, Pefrin, Pesrin, Penrin, Petenrin, Peurin. Same as in Coptic. The actual suffix pronouns still exist in Coptic though, namely at the end of prepositions and some nouns. The few differences between Middle Egyptian and Coptic in this paradigm are the same that we saw with the independent pronouns. Let's look at some verbal inflection. If you've already seen this paradigm, you're in a good way of learning Egyptian. The suffix pronouns in Middle Egyptian are the most common way of marking the subject of a verb. This is the so-called sejem f form. It can be used as a present tense, so I am hearing, you're hearing, he is hearing, etc. If we compare this to the present tense in Coptic, to be precise, the so-called first present, again it looks different, but again there's a reason for that. Let me give you the short version. In late Egyptian, the present tense verbs started to be written like this. So the suffix pronoun is attached to some kind of to particle, and in the third person you have the enclitic pronouns. There are still Coptic forms that seem to be different from the late Egyptian forms, but those can be explained with demotic. Apart from that, the so-called sejem f verb form survives in Coptic in a certain verb type. This affects verbs combined with t, to give, giving them a causative meaning. So give sit means to make somebody sit, to seat someone. And even in Coptic this is inflected like the typical Middle Egyptian verb. Temsai, temsak, temsa, temsaf, temsas, temsan, temsotne, temsau. And this, by the way, allows us to reconstruct the vocalization of the sejem f verb. And I could go on like this, with other verb inflections, noun inflection, prepositions, etc. And you would see that basically everything in Coptic can be derived from older forms of Egyptian. But let's just look at a text instead. This is the Lord's Prayer in the Bohairic dialect of Coptic, the way it's used in the Coptic Church until today. Now for the skeptics who say that Coptic is Greek, do you know how many Greek words are in here? There are two. Pirasmos, which means temptation, and Allah, which means but rather. Apart from those two, and apart from the Aramaic loanword amin, everything else in this text is Egyptian in origin. If we look at the first line, Beniot et Chenipewi, our Father who is in heaven, we can separate the first word Beniot, our Father, into segments, and this, and also the relative pronoun et, can be found in hieroglyphic Egyptian. Same with Chen, which means in, Ni, which is the plural article, and Pewi, which is the plural of Pe, meaning heavens. All of this can be found in earlier stages of Egyptian. Same with the second line, Marif tuvo in Jepekran, hallowed be thy name. Mare is an injunctive marker followed by the suffix f. Tuvo means to make holy, and all of that can be written in hieroglyphs as well. In Je marks a subject, Bekran means your name, and all of this can be written in hieroglyphs. So I think you get the idea. In conclusion, you can see that Coptic hardly differs from earlier stages of Egyptian. And of course, the more you learn it, the more parallels you see.